Okay, can we start? Everyone's phones off and all the rest. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a quorum, so we'll now commence. Apologies are being received from Brendan, Deputy Brendan Smith. He's on a Oireachtas business. Today we're convening a series of meetings with North-South implementation bodies established under the Good Friday Agreement, as agreed as part of our work programme for 2018. It's been some time before this committee has heard from some of these bodies, and I know we're all keen to get an update on their work and the challenges facing them, and in particular the impact Brexit may have on their work. Today we'll be hearing from InterTradeIreland and Tourism Ireland across two sessions. In our first session today, I'm pleased to invite representatives from InterTradeIreland in to speak with us. So, can I just suspend while the delegates come in? Is that agreed? Thank you. I'd like to formally welcome Aidan Gyo, Chief Executive of our meeting today, and Kerry Curran. In a moment I'll invite you to give your opening statement, and this will be followed by some questions from the committee, and we'll be taking the questions and answers from the floor. On behalf of the Joint Committee, before we begin, can I remind members, guests and those in the public gallery to please ensure that their mobile phones, tablets, etc. are switched off completely for the duration of the meeting, as they cause interference, even on silent mode, with the recording committee in the committee rooms. So, on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank. No, sorry, we're going again.
No, you go ahead now.
Okay, so please go ahead.
Just for the record, I think my official title is Designated Officer of InterTradeIreland.
Apologies for that.
We're unable to appoint the CEO at the minute. So, but yes, I just thought it would be worthwhile to run through, just to have a look at the achievements of InterTradeIreland and how we've changed, how the landscape has changed over this last 20 years, and then touch on the impact of Brexit. But as the committee will be well aware, we were founded formally in the British-Irish Agreement Act and the Good Friday Agreement, and the environment in which we were formed in, I thought, was very well summed up in an editorial where talked about a cold denying silence that has descended across the island and resulted in a process of fracture across all spheres of public life. This was particularly acute in the business sector. And research commissioned by us a number of years ago showed that the actual level of cross-border trade was very significantly below that what you would expect between two economies of this size sharing an island space. In fact, trade was much less than 30% of what you would expect. So, I mean, what has changed? Has things changed in the interim? From our point of view, InterTradeIreland has, we've engaged, we've advised, we've guided over 39,000 companies in this last 18, 19 years. There are companies in every county across the island. We see ourselves very much as an all-island body and working with businesses across all parts of the island and offering the opportunities that cross-border trade and business development can give to small businesses across the island. We've worked directly, supported through our programmes, 8,000 companies. Over 1,000 of them have now exported first-time exporters, and nearly 1,000 were first-time innovators. And export and innovation is critical to growth of businesses and growth of the economy. As a result of those interventions, and they are primarily with small businesses, and when we say small, we're talking at the small to micro scale rather than the 40 to 50 plus size. Through those interventions, those businesses have created for themselves over 1.2 billion of additional business development value, and they've delivered over 14,000 jobs. So the impact has been considerable of the body in the last 18 years. At a more macroeconomic level, you see total cross-border trade has doubled. It's been growing at an average rate of 4% per annum and currently stands about 6.3 billion. The cross-border market is disproportionately important for both Northern Ireland and Ireland. At present, Northern Ireland makes up about 10 to 12% of total exports from Ireland, but it's the population size. This is exports from Ireland to the UK, but the population, Northern Ireland's population size or proportion of the UK total is only 2.9%. So there's a disproportionate reliance on Northern Ireland export trade for Irish business. For over half of Irish exporters, Northern Ireland is the destination for more than half of their exports. And for 25% of Irish firms, for a quarter of Irish exporters, Northern Ireland is their only export market. So the degree of inter-reliance is considerable. It's an especially important market for small businesses. For Northern Ireland, we know that the majority of cross-border transactions are made by micro and small businesses. 74% of export deliveries involve businesses with fewer than 50 employees. 80% of micro businesses and 70% of small businesses who export from Northern Ireland sell only to the south. That's their only export market. So the type of business involved in cross-border trade is also reflected in the pattern of trade across the border. It's relatively high frequency, and it's of relatively low value, which again reflects the small business, but it also reflects a growing, as we would say, island economy. These are businesses, primarily small businesses, that are operating really and treating the island as a local market. We know there's about 208,000 vans going up and down every month across the border. They're doing it with relatively low value produce on board, but it's indicative of a market that is a local island economy. It's really a business ringing up and saying, yes, can you have that? Yes, I'll have it with you. I'll get it down the road this afternoon. So it's a market that is characterised by low value but high frequency, small businesses, and operating as a local market because there are no barriers there. So there's strong evidence too, and this has come as a result of research we've been doing over this last year, of a considerable growth and a considerable level of interconnectedness of trade through the development of cross-border supply chains. Our research, which we commissioned from the SRI, shows that the majority of cross-border trade takes place in intermediate products. That's products that are moving within supply chains, often back and forth across the border, numerous times before a final product is sold. That's really, there's how trade and the trade picture has developed, and how now we see a much more interconnected cross-border picture. It's also the same with research partnerships, which are also vital for the economies. We in InterTradeIreland convene and chair an all-island steering group for Horizon 2020. In 2014, the group agreed a strategic action plan to be implemented by ourselves, with a target to draw down 175 million in North-South collaborative projects from Horizon 2020. That's a considerable uplift on the achievement on the previous FP7, Framework Programme 7, which I think we drew down about around 75 million. But so far, the evidence suggests that and these are results from the first 2 years of Horizon 2020, North-South applications and drawdown has doubled that of the equivalent period in the previous FP7 programme. So the total drawdown to March 2018, which we have where statistics are available up to, shows that collaborative North-South applications from Horizon 2020 is around 68.5 million. Which is nearly what we achieved in the whole of the programme and the whole of the FP7 programme. So again, it's showing you just how the connectivity and the relationships have built up, and we're starting to reap value from those initiatives. We also promote or provide the Secretariat to the US-Ireland R&D partnership, and it is a partnership that is growing and delivering world-class research. Projects that are sponsored through that or supported through that programme are world class, and there's roughly about 70 million worth of world class research that is being done on that collaborative basis through the US-Ireland R&D partnership. The cross-border market, so cross-border research or cross-border cooperation is delivering. We see it just in measuring our own performance in terms of those value added and business development figures and the jobs created. But we also see it in a wider perspective. It plays a valuable role, particularly in the development of export strategy. 71% of exporters report that cross-border trading was the catalyst for exporting further afield. For 71% of businesses, their first experience of exporting was into the market, the cross-border market in this island. There they gained the confidence and the experience to go further afield. Recent research that we published by ourselves finds that cross-border exporters have higher productivity, they've higher turnover, and they employ more people than businesses that don't export. In fact, goods firms which export across the border are found to have a productivity boost of 9%. And 93% higher turnover than firms that only sell in the local market, and they employ 46% more people. So cross-border trading is delivering. And I think that the evidence shows that the degree of connectedness between Northern Ireland and Ireland has grown substantially in the past 20 years, and that cold denying silence that I spoke about at the beginning has been replaced now by a real willingness to do business, and business that is creating real value. We envisage building on these growing relationships by scaling existing partnerships and networks into wider clusters. Brexit. We've obviously, as a cross-border trade and business development body, a trade body, Brexit is exercising our minds very considerably over this last nearly 2 years now. We've undertaken first a programme of research. InterTradeIreland bases everything and all our interventions on evidence-based research. We undertake a programme of research to determine the potential impact of Brexit on the existing trade structures and to help us identify sectors and business types which are most likely to be impacted. One of the first studies we published was looked at the impact of what is known as the hard Brexit, the WTO scenario, and that concluded that it would have an impact, if nothing else changed, a negative impact of 16% on cross-border trade, and it would have an impact across all sectors, but it would be predominantly the agri-food sector. This is now well known, but I mean, we published that report 2 years ago now, so it was one of the first reports that provided that evidence. Our further reports, as I mentioned earlier, shows that supply chains are highly integrated, and the majority of goods, as I said, cross the border, do so as components within supply chains now. And that is to a much higher degree than trade with other international trade. So protecting those cross-border supply chains will be important. Cross-border trade, as we know, and I said earlier, supports increased productivity, employment and firm turnover. And also small businesses that trade across the border are at the greatest risk. They fall into the highest risk categories. They're most exposed to a hard Brexit, basically because they don't have the capabilities and the resources to deal with extra bureaucracy, and we've found that they're operating at relatively low margins. So that's in terms of the research. The research is obviously much more detailed. That's the headline points from it, and Kerry will have the details of that. We've also opened very quickly a Brexit advisory service to help businesses navigate through whatever new relationship emerges from the negotiations. That Brexit advisory service, well, the first thing we did was to get out and to speak to businesses. And really our message there was to tune down the noise, because we were very concerned and remain concerned. At that stage there was only something like 98% of businesses were basically ignoring Brexit and not planning. We were trying to get them to start planning for it, because and we were helping them with that process, because the main reason for them not planning, as they told us, was uncertainty. But there were issues, there were scenario planning, there were risk impact assessments that they could undertake to see where they were exposed, so that they are ready for whatever scenario emerges. So since then we have had events all over the island. We continue to have events. We've also introduced a Brexit voucher, which is assisting small businesses to start the planning process. They can claim up to €2,000 to get expert advice to see where they're most exposed and to start taking action. That service is. There's a very, very high demand for that service, and it's rising all the time. I think we've given out 675 vouchers, about roughly 50-50 north-south over this, but that has been a rise. That it was slow at the start, and now it's really starting to take off, and we have a very busy team there trying to meet demand.
Take off even more after today.
It could well do, yeah. So I think that's it. That'll do for the opening.
Okay. Kerry, do you want to come in?
No, no further comments.
No questions. Declan Ra.
Firstly, thanks for your presentation, Aidan. Just a couple of questions relating to, obviously, the research and to what degree you can answer the following, say, questions. I mean, in an exit, regardless, hard, soft or otherwise, there's a high degree, particularly south-north, of companies, for example, if you take road maintenance as a classic example, that trade in the south. The tendering process around, obviously, EU tendering and whatever, what are the implications going to be for, say, northern companies being able to actually partake in an EU tendering process if they're outside the EU? You mentioned just once the issue of south-north movement of obviously giving out vouchers and whatever. I mean, what sort of numbers of people relative to people taking businesses from the trading from the north into the south? What degree is the south trading into the north? Because we rarely hear of many companies who are benefiting, if you like, in exporting into the north, and I'm interested to know if you have any ideas on the figures. And you refer then to, say, the programme Horizon 2020 and the large amount of money that was involved. Again, very much EU-led programmes. How are these going to be sustained, or is there any commitment in a post-Brexit situation to guarantee them? We've had various people in here from, the Peace and Reconciliation Funds and one of the other who are saying that there's guarantees up to 2022. What guarantees have you in relation to your own organisation, if any?
Yeah, in terms of tendering, We do. I mean, one of our programmes is assist businesses enter the cross-border public procurement market. And there are a number of issues that could make that more difficult in terms of Brexit. Kerry will maybe go into them in a minute. In terms of the numbers, as said, we know that 25% of Irish exporters sell only to the north. So that's a considerable amount of businesses. 50% of them sell 50% of their produce to the north. So it's a considerable amount of businesses that are involved in cross-border trade from an Irish perspective. We struggle to get the exact numbers from the statistics. We know in Northern Ireland there's, I think it's approximately about 7,800, is it? Small businesses trade annually into the south. So it's a considerable amount of businesses that are involved in cross-border trade, and that is very important. It's the number of businesses, not just the value. The number of businesses involved in cross-border trade is substantial and disproportionate, because it is, for many small businesses now, it is regarded as a local market almost.
Sorry, just you have a figure for north-south, into which you've said 7,800. Why is there not a figure in terms of who's trading south, or is there? Sorry.
No, if I can answer that. The reason why we don't have the exact figure for south to north is the way that the data is collected on firms by the Central Statistics Office. So what we have in terms of hard data is around the Interstat returns of cross-border traders. Obviously, those are firms who are trading above that threshold of €635,000. So we have those in terms of solid numbers, but the rest of the data that we have is through survey data. So, for example, our All-Ireland Business Monitor, which has been going for 10 years now, on average we see about 20% of the firms in the south saying that they're trading north, and that's on average over the past 10 years worth of data. But in terms of actual solid statistical numbers from the Central Statistics Office, that doesn't exist.
Just as a final observation, I'm sorry to come in a third time, but I travel the motorway every day, and the degree of the small business who are trading into the city here, particularly whether it's carpentry, electrical services, certainly if you're coming the other way, heading south north, I would say it's a very, very small fraction of small businesses who are able to trade into the north or getting the opportunity, and it's something that always strikes me, that there's an imbalance, a large imbalance between the availability of people being able to trade south-north, but yet an awful lot of impediment for small business to trade.
In terms of our programmes,
into the north,
roughly 2/3 of the businesses that participate in our programmes come from the south.
Just the EU, it was just a question that Declan had asked, and I don't know, did you get a chance to answer, was on EU procurement rules, like businesses, like how is Brexit going to affect ability for northern companies to actually do those or tender for those jobs?
So the latest technical notice and advice on this from the UK government, which was published recently, actually advises businesses in the north that they will be able to apply for public tendering in the south. And likewise, there will be a new e-tender system for the UK, which again will, all things being equal, businesses from the south, or indeed the rest of Europe, should be able to apply to those through that e-tender system.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Your presentation is just one of a number that really shows what Brexit can possibly, the damage that Brexit can do, and I think also the way in which the kind of issues that you brought up today certainly were not being considered when people were voting on Brexit. The research that you did, and I know it is directing your work, but has it gone anywhere else, in terms of governments, particularly in the UK, that they would be influenced by it in any sort of way? So that's the first question. We know it must have been difficult for companies, I can understand where they're coming from, but to plan for something that they don't know exactly what it's going to be. Hard Brexit, soft Brexit, another referendum, whatever. Have you, and it's interesting the number of people who've taken up the offer for help at this point. Are you envisaging more? And have you the capacity to help more on that planning? Third one is, we know about the agri-food business, so are you seeing to date harm that has been done already in that particular area. My last one is about, you mentioned there about the high-level visitors from the EU partners and what sort of response you got when you had those meetings. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't get the last question.
When you, in the briefing that we got here, you hosted a number of high-level visitors from the EU partners as part of the government's efforts to increase understanding of the complexities of the border issue. And I was just wondering what sort of response you got from those meetings.
Okay, in terms of our research is almost always conducted. We form a committee to oversee the research. On our committees, we have our departments, our sponsor departments. So the research feeds immediately into the policy frameworks, and it's also within, I presume, in Northern Ireland, the departments there have links with what's going on in London. So we think that it has been influential. We think that it has raised the issues. You know, the work we did on non-tariff barriers and the impact of WTO was the first really hard evidence of the impact, the potential impact of a hard Brexit scenario. So, and it did feed into policy makers. In terms of companies and demand, yes, we envisage a rise in demand. You know, we don't know what the new relationship will be, but it is likely to be at least some changes to the trading relationship. We don't know what. So we do, it may be just reassurance that we have to give, hopefully, but we are planning for a rise in demand, and we have increased our budget to our Brexit Advisory Service accordingly for next year. In terms of the impact on the agri-food industry, it's I would say probably the biggest impact to date on it is being felt in Northern Ireland in terms of access to skills and access to labour, and the reduction and the willingness of European migrant labour to take up positions in the Northern Ireland industry. That is by far the biggest impact. I'm not sure what you mean about the high level.
Well, it's just what we were told, that you did host some high level visitors from the EU partners.
Yes, we were invited to host meetings. Yes, we didn't actually arrange the meetings. We had Michel Barnier was in InterTrade meeting the business community. The meeting, he heard the views of cross-border traders, and direct from the horse's mouth, if you like, and the difficulties that they would envisage and that they would experience from any sort of barriers to trade, particularly in the areas of form filling and customs, and the costs that would bring.
No.
Sure, yeah, thanks very much. Apologies to step out for some of the presentation, but I just wanted to ask briefly if, in terms of the obviously you've outlined quite a significant number of issues there facing businesses in cross-border trade. I'm just wondering, given the expertise not just of the organisations you work with, but you yourselves corporately, what level of engagement there has been with the Irish government in terms of preparedness work, but also alternatively, has the British government at any stage sought out your expertise, engagement, information in terms of crafting and shaping their own either negotiation approach or more, their more general approach in relation to Brexit?
Yeah, I mean, we're funded by the departments for the economy in Northern Ireland, the Department of Business in the south. We have been given additional funding to support our Brexit interventions. by both Northern Ireland and the Southern Government. We work very closely in terms of there's a campaign ongoing at the minute that's sponsored by the Irish Government, so we're speaking at all those events. I think there's one today or tomorrow. There's one in Cork and there's one, is it in Galway today? But we speak at all those events, so we're integrally
Getting Ireland Brexit ready events,
yes,
is it?
Yes, yeah.
I've expressed disappointment with the department that there's none of them happening in the north, and I'm sure you would share that disappointment given the nature of your own work, but I wouldn't ask you to comment on that. Yes. But specifically there in relation to the British government, I appreciate where the funding comes from, but I just wonder whether at official level or ministerial, political level, has there been any engagement with yourselves in terms of, I'm not looking at any state secrets or anything, like I don't want to, but just in terms of other craft, and if there is any craft involved,
we have had
approach.
Interest in the services that we're delivering.
Okay.
We've had visits from UK government departments who are interested in the services that we have been delivering, because we did introduce these services very early. And in fact, we've had them evaluated already, and we're able to say about the success of for instance, the voucher. The 85% of businesses who've received it were delighted with the advice they got. So we have had engagement at that level in terms of the interest in the services that we're delivering. Yeah.
See, just finally, Chair, see in terms of the Brexit voucher you mentioned,
yeah.
Could you tell us a wee bit, because I don't know if there's a kind of like a uniform approach to that, or if it's different for each business. What
yeah.
primarily is that being utilised for by businesses? I'm just interested in terms of what that actually means in terms of assisting them to get Brexit ready. If you're a shopkeeper, or if you're, I don't know, a factory owner or whatever, how does that look in terms of getting ready for Brexit?
Yeah. I mean, we make it easy for businesses to access it, because the businesses that are impacted, are most exposed to Brexit, are small businesses. So, and these are businesses that don't have the time nor the capability. So it's an easily accessible service. It's £2,000 to deal with an issue that they identify. A potential impact of Brexit, and whether that's informational or operational, or it could be with technical, like how do I deal with, what does VAT mean, what are going to be the implications of changing in VAT, what if there were customs, what would I have to do, so it's really, it's basic stuff.
It's upskilling, kind of, in a way. It's primarily on that,
and it's risk assessment in many ways as well. Where am I exposed? And then it should outline what should I do as well.
And do you then deliver that training?
We've created a framework of experts and that we can draw down on at the business. So if it is a specific tax issue, they can get a tax expert to do that.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Sure.
And Gurmiagav to both of you for the presentation so far. You talked about how a lot of the business, cross-border business, that is done by small businesses is high frequency and low value, and we know there are millions of journeys across the border, millions just on the border crossings that they count, never mind the hundreds that they don't count. So do you have a sense of the vulnerability of businesses that are operating on low margins that may have an impact either on time or on, if there are any kind of checks or customs or stops at the border, what that time is going to mean? I think for a HGV, the average it out at £1 a minute. So if there's an additional 5 minutes and X amount of times a year, what that is going to cost, do you think? There will be businesses who will fold as a result of Brexit. Also, I've first-hand experience of the challenges that faced the agri-food sector when all of Ireland was in the European Union and we were operating across the border that we've had for the past decade. So I know how difficult Brexit is likely to be for that sector, but also, do you have any statistics at all on, you talked about the lack of skills and the lack of availability of workers, Aidan. do you have a ballpark of how many workers were short in the agri-food sector or the engineering sector? Because I know, again, from personal experience in Tyrone, there's not an engineering firm that have got their full cohort of staff, and everybody is crying out for work, and that is impacting on firms' ability to take on orders and to fulfil those orders.
But just, I mean, I drive through Tyrone a lot and I see the signs up where all of welders wanted, you know, but I don't have exact figures on that. I'm not sure if Kerry's come across them. On
No, not on that, but I would say that sort of like the Department for the Economy are, I think, working actually across a number of departments to actually look at that whole skills piece. And there's actually an event tomorrow where we'll hopefully find out more about what's known and what the future plans are to identify the skills needs for Northern Ireland in particular.
And in terms of the impact, we're actually just completing a study at the minute that is looking at the shock absorption capacity, just the capacity of businesses to deal with any shocks to the trading relationship, and we're just completing that at the minute. But is there any information you can share at the minute?
Just as in terms of sort of like overarching messages coming out of this piece of research, we are seeing sort of a majority of businesses vulnerable or in at-risk groups in relation to the shock cost associated with Brexit, and you know that's in the region both in terms of imports and exports of about 3/4 of businesses, so it's quite for Northern Ireland, so very significant for Northern Ireland firms. You mentioned also some of the issues around vulnerability and time, and while we haven't calculated that or have very specific issues around vulnerability and time, in our first piece of research in this, looking at the impact of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, we did calculate that non-tariff barrier piece for in terms of implications on cross-border trade, and it alone would account for a 9% reduction on a hard Brexit scenario of that cross-border trade, and that includes assumptions around the additional cost of time. And to give an anecdotal piece, if I may, we have spoken to a whole range of businesses who have mentioned concerns around the potential for time delays if there were any customs, for example, at the border, or indeed any delays in them actually making their journey. And we do have a number of firms in Northern Ireland who provide just-in-time services to firms in the south. So, for example, the immediate delivery of medical supplies for surgery, which really is on a just-in-time basis as the surgery gets scheduled. And any delays to that sort of process would mean that those businesses would need to reroute their supply chains in order to meet the demand of their customers. So there are some quite far-reaching implications if there are delays in delivering goods across the border.
Okay. I mean, in terms of the form filling and the costs of that, Northern Ireland's manufacturing industry representative group have calculated them as very substantial. You know, in terms of the delay, it's much more than £1 per minute. It amounts into hundreds of pounds when you take in all the administrative costs that are around that as well. A business that we were working with, you know, that does upwards of, you know, close to 100 deliveries a day, if they had to start filling in forms in that at a very, very, very conservative estimate, it would add on a cost of close to 750,000 to £1 million, which in a small business can be an existential threat.
Absolutely. Just if I may, Ciarán, a supplementary to that. It's interesting on the back of Niall's question that there hasn't really, you haven't been inundated with requests from the British government that as to how Brexit will impact on all Ireland trade. Not surprising, but at the same time, you know, the fact that they haven't sought out your point of view, whether the Department of Economy has forwarded on your views or not, I don't know, but they certainly haven't sought out your views. I think that's just very telling.
Frank, you looking to come in?
Yeah,
Do you want to comment on that now? No.
I'll try not to go over ground cover, but thanks for your presentation. And it's remarkable what's happened in the last 20 years when you say the increase in trade and that, and I hope it remains. Just you said a low value export. What is a low value export? Just is it agriculture, or what? And secondly, to protect the cross-border supply chain in the event of Brexit, I know it's happening. What can we do to protect that cross-border supply chain? But apart from that, there's other questions, but they've already been asked. So thank you.
Maybe before you finish, could I ask